Good evening from the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Welcome to the President Speaker Series. I'm Marc Bernier. Tonight, the subject that has gripped the nation for the last several years now is in the form of a book, Same-Sex Marriage, as it makes its way through the courts. There are new statistics that indicate that the American public has changed its view on the subject of same-sex marriage over the last few years, and that may have been the reason that the courts changed their minds. We'll find out how much of this was the changing view of the American people and how much of it was new information that became known to the court. Our guest tonight is a person who had the pleasure of being embedded with the lawyers for a number of years. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She is the author of the new book that just came out in the last couple of months, Forcing the Spring. Ladies and gentlemen, a giant Embry-Riddle welcome to New York Times best-selling author, Jo Becker. Jo, thanks for making the trip to see us here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
I tried to think of what question am I going to ask this lady that she hasn't been asked by the networks already, and I guess the obvious one is, why did you choose this topic?
So you have to go back a little bit. I wrote a story about Ted Olson, and Ted Olson, of course, is the guy who won Bush v. Gore for Bush, and he and David Boies, who lost Bush v. Gore for Gore, teamed up to bring this case asking for full marriage equality across the nation and to bring this all the way to the Supreme Court. And I just thought, I knew Ted and David, actually. I'd covered the recount here in Florida. I'd watched Ted sort of over the years. He played a very interesting role in a book, in a series that I wrote about Dick Cheney, where he was one of the few people that said, I want to insist that these detainees have to have lawyers. Fascinating, because Ted lost his wife on board one of those planes. So I always thought that Ted was a much more complicated guy than the man that liberals kind of love to hate, and I wanted to find out why he came to embrace this cause. So I wrote a story, and it ran on the front page of the New York Times, and I just found I couldn't let it go. There was this incredible operation. You had, two sort of superstar lawyers funded by Rob Reiner, a Hollywood director who's made famous movies like When Harry Met Sally. The four plaintiffs that are really at the heart of this book, I got to know them a little bit in the reporting of the story. And I've always been fascinated by the civil rights fights of the previous era, and you think, what is it like to be a plaintiff in one of these major civil rights suits? I mean, what's it like to go from just being kind of two moms raising 4 teenage boys, and in that case of the other couple, a guy who was a fitness instructor and a guy who runs a movie theater, and suddenly, be cast into this light. And so I thought, if I could tell that inside story, I sort of imagined it like, what if a reporter had been embedded in Brown v. Board of Ed, as opposed to historians trying to kind of piece it all together? What would that look like? So I went to Ted and to Chad Griffin, who is sort of the main character of this book. He is a political operative, cut his teeth in the Clinton White House. Eventually he teams up, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Ken Millman, joins him on the political side of this fight, because they were using this litigation to mount a really sophisticated presidential level public education campaign, and everything was bipartisan, and I just wanted to know, what was this going to be like? What would happen?
All right, several issues here before we lose people, because there's a lot of information. First, Ted Olson is probably one of the most unlikely people to represent the same-sex marriage interest, because you had this hallmark of being a conservative lawyer. To back up a little bit, you covered politics in Tallahassee before, and you were here for the recount and all of that. And it really was the first major election in which lawyers became prevalent. I mean, 50,000 of them I heard at one point. Mm-hmm. So Olson recruits his opponent, the guy who represented Al Gore, to work with him to push their case forward. And what they're doing is trying to, correct me if I'm wrong, overturn Proposition 8.
And bans like it all across America.
Right, and they want to take it to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. The Reiners write a check to start of at least $100,000. And I'm thinking to myself, when I'm going to ask you, what's in it for them to invest this much in it?
Sure. Well, some people say, this is a case, scripted by Hollywood. It's actually, it's more complicated and nuanced, as everything usually is. Chad Griffin, the young man who is the center of this book, the political consultant, he is a big Democratic fundraiser. He basically was the conduit for Hollywood money for Democratic presidential candidates. But he was like a son to Rob Reiner. And he came out late in life, and one of the first people he sat down and told was Rob and his wife, Michelle. And so when Proposition 8 passed, on the night that it passed, Chad was sitting in a hotel room, and he, everybody in his world, they're all, Democrats, are, exuberant. The first African-American president had just been elected, but he's sort of watching the returns come in. And as the president is sort of saying change has come to America, he's realizing that it hasn't come for everybody, and it certainly hasn't come for people like him, and gays and lesbians, because Proposition 8 passed. Here in Florida, an anti-gay initiative also passed on adoption, I believe. And in Arkansas, the home state where he grew up in, same thing. And so a couple weeks later, he was kind of commiserating with his friends. His friends just happened to be famous Hollywood people, the Reiners, and they were at the Polo Lounge, which is this kind of place where movie people come to kind of make deals, and just sort of saying, well, what could they do? And by happenstance, this woman walks by the table, a friend of Michelle's, and learns what they're talking about. Says, you should talk to my brother-in-law, my ex-brother-in-law. He's a constitutional lawyer. I think he'd be on your side of this. And they said, well, who is it? I said, Ted Olson. I mean, Rob Reiner's jaw fell to the floor. On the night that Bush v. Gore was won, and Ted Olson was celebrating with Ken Starr and others, and Rob and Chad Griffin had driven to the Supreme Court alone after being at the vice president's home and watching this happen, and they just sort of stood dejected outside of the Supreme Court, and they thought, like Ted Olson, why on earth would I want to talk to him? But they both realized right away that if a guy as conservative as Ted Olson would take on this cause, that could be a game changer.
There's so many twists and turns in this story. Just to relate to you, the fact that he would take his opponent, and Ted Olson, for those of you who may not know, was a Solicitor General at one point in the Bush administration. The kind of eerie thing about this is that Barbara Olson was supposed to be here at Embry-Riddle in November of 2001.
Oh my goodness.
And on 9/11, they used to take messages with paper. Some of you may remember that. And I had a telephone message from Barbara Olson the early morning of 9/11 saying, Mark, I'll be at Embry-Riddle in November of 2001. And she died in the plane crash. We talked to Ted later. He has since remarried. And in the book, you talk about the type of guy he is. This is not a typical story. It's about people who believed in a right. You caught flack from an MSNBC host for your first sentence of the book. And you were being accused of, in essence, reinventing this story as to suggest it begins, I believe it is, this is how a revolution begins. You were being accused of suggesting that your book, your story, is how this whole movement began, and it didn't. But what you were doing was, am I correct? Indicating how this story begins, not the whole issue of same-sex marriage.
That's true. That's exactly right. And I think anybody that even opened the front cover of it and said this is a story of Proposition 8 and DOMA and the two cases that went to the Supreme Court. But what's interesting about that is what is the definition of revolution? It's an insurrection. This was an insurrection. This case was and the DOMA case, by the way, was an insurrection against all of the conventional thinking of the established LGBT rights groups. And it's not that they didn't agree with the outcome, obviously, right? They were really scared that the country wasn't ready and that the Supreme Court wouldn't be ready. And there's this meeting at the Reiner's house, which I describe in the book. And they've basically been doing all of this work in secret to try to find plaintiffs, to try to bring this case, kind of pull it all together. And they've decided to that they had to let these groups know. So they bring together Land Illegal and the ACLU and fill them in on what they're thinking about. And it's like all of these lawyers sort of exploded in a kind of cacophony of criticism. And what they said was, you can't count to 5, basically, meaning 5 out of the 9. That there wouldn't be 5 of the 9 justices that would be willing to say that this was a right. And not only that, but you will lose and you will set back the movement by decades. And these lawyers remembered what had happened in a case called Bowers. In the Bowers case, they the ACLU had brought a challenge against the sodomy law in Georgia, and criminalizing gay sex, and they lost. And that case was used to justify all sorts of other discrimination against gays and lesbians for quite some time. So they were really, really worried about this. And at one point, one of the lawyers threw down a dossier that he compiled of all of the conservative causes that Ted Olson had ever championed, and said, if you do this, we'll release this whole thing to the media. And Chad Griffin, the political consultant sort of at the heart of this decision to go this route, looked at him and said, good, do it. Because if anybody, if someone that supports this cause supports us, that'll change people's minds. And again, they always thought of this as a public education campaign that would go alongside this lawsuit.
Did I read this correctly, that an interesting factoid between Boies and Olson was when Olson was going for a Solicitor General, it was actually Boies that called the people that wanted to bury Olson and pull them out of the fire.
Yeah, you sort of wonder, how did these two guys even come to know each other well enough for Ted Olson to pick up the phone and call this guy that he'd fought, over the presidency with? And the answer is kind of, when you're involved in those kind of high stakes cases, there are only a few people that want to talk about it as incessantly as you do. Your wife, maybe, and the guy on the other side, about all the twists and turns, and never get bored. They never get bored of it. And so Ted and David had, after, of course, swapped notes and been talking, and they discovered that they had a love of very, very good wine. They both like to drink good wine. And they began taking trips together, like bicycling trips with their wives, and they became friends.
When they're going through the argument, because this is one of the things I think everyone here is going to be wondering about, how do they get around the procreation angle? One of the arguments is same-sex marriage should not be allowed because there is no procreation at the end of the day. Olson answered that in an interview I heard on The Takeaway on NPR when he said, look, if it's all about procreation, please explain how I just married some people in their 80s.
Well,
they're not going to procreate.
This was the judge. Judge Walker actually said that during Judge Walker was the federal judge that heard this case, and there was a full-blown trial. There was evidence put on. So Judge Walker, kind of interesting point. Ted Olson wanted to take this case up on what's called, on motions. In other words, these were legal arguments. We didn't need a trial. Let's go to the Supreme Court. Judge Walker, the judge who was hearing it at the federal district court level, said, whoa, wait a minute. All sorts of allegations are being made. You're saying that, this ban on allowing gays and lesbians to marry causes terrible hurt and harm. Prove it. Chuck Cooper, the lawyer who defended Proposition 8 and the ban in California on same-sex marriage, was saying, well, it's totally reasonable to discriminate in this fashion because this promotes the best child-rearing environment, children being raised by their biological mother and father. And so Judge Walker held a trial, and at one point, he kept coming back to Cooper and saying, well, I don't understand this whole procreation argument. I just married an 80-year-old couple. And, are you saying that the state should only marry people who are capable of procreating? Because in that case, we shouldn't just ban gays and lesbians from marrying. We should ban anybody that's over a certain age and anybody that's barren and anybody, and what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to test? Are we supposed to say, are you capable of having children? Let's do a fertility test or whatever, and it just didn't make a lot of sense. And as the trial went on, one of the really fascinating things that went on trial, and so much did, was this whole argument about, is it true, actually, that children are actually best off if they're raised by their biological mother and father? A lot of the studies that suggested that, it turned out, had put in adoptive parents.
Adopted parents raised
In other words, the studies that were showing us, like,
the end result is better?
Included adoptive parents. So it really wasn't saying that biological parents are the best. And of course, in California, like in many other places, gays and lesbians could adopt children and did adopt children. There are some, at the time, I can't remember, it's about 40,000 children being raised by same-sex couples in California. So, and then the more and more evidence that went on, that went on trial, the studies that were put into evidence showed, in fact, that's not true, actually. Children do best when their parents are in loving, stable, committed relationships. Marriage encourages that. So in fact, by denying gays and lesbians the right to marry, it goes against the state interest in the sense that if you believe that marriage is a stabilizing force, and that children do best when they're raised by stable parents who don't leave, then you, in the interest of children, you would want gays and lesbians to marry.
Why do you think the majority of Americans have changed their view and are now more favorable to same-sex marriage? What caused that to happen?
So that's a really complicated question, so I'd like to kind of break it down.
Okay.
The title of the book is called Forcing the Spring. And essentially it comes from a Bill Clinton first inaugural speech.
No kidding.
Which he says, you know, by our words, by our deeds. It was the inauguration. This ceremony takes place in the depth of winter, but by our words, by our deeds, we force the spring. And of course, there's an irony there, because Bill Clinton, president that signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, president that signed DOMA, which refused to recognize legally married same-sex couples in states that allowed it. You know, for his generation, you know, full equality did not include gays and lesbians. So that said, for a new generation of Americans, the millennial generation, a lot of your students, I'm sure, you know, they just don't see this as an issue. They don't get it. They don't understand why we're all fighting about it. And so change was coming. And the question was, how fast? And so Chad and this group decided to, you know, force the spring and bring this federal lawsuit, because for them, every day that these bans kind of existed, it fueled when you have this kind of, their argument was, when you have this kind of state-sponsored discrimination, when the state says certain couples are worthy of this marital relationship, but other couples aren't, it's a license for other people to discriminate. It fuels bullying. That, you know, and it harms people. There's a stigma to kind of being seen as kind of inferior and second class. There's a lot of evidence about that I write about in the book, in the trial.
I did read the book,
yeah.
As everybody can see. There was a section that a judge spoke out and said, someone said, are we supposed to wait until the American public comes to this decision before judges make a decision?
Right. That was a big tension. I mean, so when they brought this case and when I started following it, there were only 2 states in the country that allowed same-sex marriage. The majority of Americans were opposed. They had just lost in California. If they can't win on the left coast, Chad's and the Reiners and Ted and David's thinking went, where could they win at the ballot box? And for them, the idea that the LGBT community and the legal rights groups had been pursuing this kind of state-by-state strategy, and they wanted 30 states to be in the sort of recognition column, recognizing some form of gay and lesbians relationships before you would take this to the federal court, for the reasons that we just discussed a little bit earlier. And but Chad and this group said, well, but look, your state-by-state strategy, we won in California. We took this to the state court, and then the voters just turned around and took it away. So what could be given at the state level could also be taken away, and that was one of the lessons for them of the Prop 8 loss. So they decided to kind of, you know, go this route, and it was the first case of its kind. It was the first federal trial of its kind. And it really was an amazing journey, and with, as you said, lots of twists and turns.
We're going to take questions from you in the audience in just a few minutes. Be thinking about what you wish to ask, and both Alyssa and Kyle will come. Alyssa from the left, Kyle from the right, and we'll try to get all of your questions on the record. How much money did this cost? It's probably impossible to tell us how much the government spent, but it sounds like an awful lot of money to push this agenda for what really was, 4 years? It started in 2009 until really the heart of this book to 2013, correct?
Yeah.
Now, they said they were only going to take 250,000. Is that what you wrote?
No. It was Ted Olson. I think his firm was deeply discounted. I think it was around, you're testing my memories, around $6 million. And then.
But up front, he was only taking a little bit.
David Boies took less.
Yeah.
But you know, you have to sort of look at this in a different way, which is that you know, the amount of money that was spent just on Proposition 8. And remember, there were constitutional bans enacted all across this country.
Okay.
Proposition 8 was the most expensive, but there were other very expensive fights. That fight, I think, was, I want to say it was $40 million just on that political fight. So it was going ballot box by ballot box by ballot box. That was another thing. Donors were exhausted, and they would lost every time. There was 0 for 30 at the ballot box, gays and lesbians. 0 for 30. I mean, that tells you that the American public wasn't there. And what was, I think, remarkable, and I think one of the theses of the book is, look, I think that the number one reason why the country is changing, there's many reasons. I started to say, we have the millennial generation that's sort of pushing that eventually this is going to happen. You have, you also have people coming out and telling their story. And once you realize, oh, it's my, you know, it's my son, it's my uncle, it's my, you know, lawyer, it's my doctor, it's my classmate, and they're just like me. You know, as Ken Mellman, who is the executive director of the Republican Party, and he was the architect.
Who we found out was gay.
Well, he came out precisely because of this case, because he saw that this was a bipartisan effort, and he said, I'm going to come out, I want to take part in this effort. And he told his story, and then he joined the board of this group that was bringing the case. And so as you move through time in this book, and the case is kind of going all along through the court system, what you see is that the country starts to change. Again, I think the number one reason that the country is changing is people coming out and telling their story. You are much more likely to support same-sex marriage if you personally know someone who's gay. That said, the country was not moving at this record pace, but as soon as the first ruling came out, the federal district court ruling, sweeping ruling, basically looking at all the evidence and saying, none of this makes sense. You have to have a reason to discriminate. You have to have some reason. The state can't just
Let me be devil's advocate and ask you, okay, because there are some people who believe that the media drove this. They kept pounding away, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, and finally the public was moved to accept it.
Well, certainly that was part of the strategy. I mean, you know, I write a lot about this, about how so you have this legal team that's working its way through the Supreme, you know, up to the Supreme Court, but meanwhile you've got this political team. Chad and Ken Mellman came and joined that effort. And, you know, I would say it's twofold. One reason is that, you know, Michelle Bachmann was just asked today about this issue, I think it was today or yesterday, and about whether this was a losing issue for the Republican Party, essentially long term.
What'd she say?
Yeah, basically. That this
Even
is something
Buchanan
that
backed away.
I mean, there's nobody's talking about this, but that didn't happen by accident. Ken Mellman, he as part of this whole operation, the political operation that I write about, you know, he did things like he did polling among Republican voters, likely Republican voters, and he found a number of things. He could show them that this was inevitable, and that young people, they were going to lose young people over this. And in fact, the Republican autopsy after Romney lost said that. And it was written in part by, I think, Sally Bradshaw from here in Florida, Jeb Bush's old chief of staff. And so there was a whole kind of thing that was going on the Republican side. But he was talking to people in Iowa, people who were the guys on the ground that do the presidential races, and saying, you don't want your guys talking about this loudly. And so the Republican side has really kind of toned down because they sort of see this as a very complicated issue going forward for them. At the same time, you had a really sophisticated kind of political operation that was going on, and they learned to talk about things in a different way. They showcase people like, you know, people who, especially after Don't Ask, Don't Tell, for instance, was repealed. They showcased veterans, and they said things like, you know, do we really want to tell the men and women who are serving us in Afghanistan and Iraq that they can't marry the person that they love? and they would showcase these kind of what they called everyday heroes. This was kind of a big Ken Mehlman special, like because what they realized is like people generally, Republicans, independents, everybody doesn't like the idea of the government kind of telling us what to do. So they just talked about things in a different way. And the other thing that was really interesting was they wrapped this, I think, around the American flag, literally. Chad Griffin, I think, understood the power of television and visual. So at every hearing, and I write about this in the book, where they knew that there was going to be television cameras because of the star quality appeal of this marquee kind of.
So they
lawyers.
indoctrinated the public.
Well, I don't know if it was indoctrinated. Chad said, "I don't want rainbow flags outside of these court hearings. I want people with American flags." And because this is an American value. I mean, he believed that, and he thought that the kind of rainbow flag separated people, where if you had the American flag there, which it visually said this is an American right, and they talked about this in terms of liberty, in terms of all of the things that kind of American values that we all cherish, and as opposed to talking about rights and demands.
How did they handle the religious component of the argument? Did they basically ignore them or shut them out?
Well, no, I think they were really sensitive to it. Ted, there's a chapter in the book called, I think it's God, Gays, and Political Power.
Yes.
And there was a real debate, right? Because they needed to show that the Proposition 8 campaign was driven by prejudice. Like, that's not allowed. If it was passed out of prejudice, that's not constitutional. There's lots of precedent for that. So, they were going through all the kind of campaign records and the things that they had gotten through discovery, and what they realized was that the ground troops that really had driven the kind of campaigning for Proposition 8 were largely large churches and religious organizations. Initially, Ted Olson was very reluctant to kind of put that stuff on trial. At one point, he said, I don't want this to be God versus gays. And he understood, he said, look, I've got a lot of friends. And I describe a scene in which one friend of his, and he lost several over this, said, I just don't see it the way you do. And, but he wanted to be respectful of that. And it was important that they be respectful over that. Because, again, this is not just a legal campaign, it's a political campaign. And if you basically attack people based on their religions, that's not a message that's really going to get people to change their minds. That said, they started to look at this, and they really thought that it was necessary to put a little bit of this on trial, but not sort of to say, oh, the Catholic Church is bad, or the Southern Baptists are bad, or anything like that. It was just to show that gays and lesbians were up against very powerful organizational institutions that could mobilize people and show that, and then also show that the campaigning that they were doing behind the scenes was in fact, sort of motivated by what would classically be termed as animus. So when you have people at rallies, preachers at rallies comparing, gays and lesbians to people who practice bestiality, that's evidence that can be shown as sort of being, it wasn't just, as Chuck Cooper was arguing in court, the lawyer defending Proposition 8, that this was about procreation. Because if you looked at the campaign messaging, there was plenty of things about, that gays and lesbians would go and somehow that they would corrupt your children. I mean, there was lots of messaging that was not just, hey, we ought to pass this to encourage responsible procreation.
In the run-up to your appearance here, I had gone back to look over some studies because there was information being passed around that said that same-sex couples who adopt children, they're going to be gay. There is no evidence that supports that. As a matter of fact, it's microscopic. I think it's to the point now where they won't even say it's even. They said that it's actually, you have less of a chance of having a person grow up and adopt a gay lifestyle if they are raised by same-sex parents. Was Florida the last state, to your knowledge, that would allow adoption by same-sex?
To allow it?
Yeah, because I know that they didn't, and Rosie O'Donnell was suing down here. And then I heard something changed.
I mean, there was Arkansas, there was Florida, there were a few that, but those I think all basically fell under courts, right? I mean, I think what happened here in Florida? Did they repeal it, or was it a court?
I think that they repealed it because now they can't. But the question of what is to be gained, is there a downside to the shift in this country now? Is anybody making a successful case that there is a downside to same-sex marriage?
No,
is it moral decay? What do they claim?
Well, it's interesting because the first case, this case, it turns out that the federal judge was gay, and that became an issue, and I write about that. But every single judge that has heard these cases since this one has come to the exact same conclusion. Richard Posner, hardly a liberal, just wrote for an appellate court decision that said it's just nonsense to think that there's any benefit to children to limiting marriage to a man and a woman, and really took each of the arguments and knocked them down one by one. Every court but one. I think there's one in Louisiana, a federal district court judge. But today we've got 19 states plus the District of Columbia, and challenges in every other state left where there still these bans remain in place.
Let's do a sidebar, the Cheneys, okay? You wrote a lot about Dick Cheney. I like Dick Cheney. If I read all of your stuff, am I not going to like Dick Cheney anymore?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It was an interesting thing.
Because a lot of press people don't like him.
A 4-part series in the Washington Post, and it was amazing to me because this is one of the rare instances where people on both sides said, I loved it. A lot of the people that, real supporters of the vice president said that they really liked it because it accurately described his role. I did not say that he was the shadow president. I don't believe that.
Or Bush's brain.
Or Bush's brain. But look, he was very adept at working the lower levels of the government to tee up, to infuse kind of discussions with his point of view, so that the ultimate decision that got teed up to the president was not his point of view versus like 3 other points of view. It was his point of view, first choice, second choice, and maybe there'd be somebody else's point of view in there.
Right. Now, one of the Cheney girls is gay.
Right.
How did they handle the issue? And then as this story is evolving, do they decide to sit this one out, not say anything, or they're obviously publicly, they're supporting their daughter?
Well,
but how do they handle the issue?
Up until Ted Olson took this case, Dick Cheney was the most prominent Republican to support same-sex marriage. He did not see it as a constitutional right. He took the position that states should make up their own mind, but that he would encourage them to allow this. But I wanted to sort of say again, I think that when people come to know someone who is close to them, who's gay, it's really hard to not want for them what you want for all your other children. I mean, Rob Portman, possible presidential candidate, totally opposed to same-sex marriage. His son came out, he changed his mind. I mean, I don't know, tell me a little bit about reading the book, like from your perspective. Did you learn things?
Yes, I did.
Your mind, like in what way?
It was what I hoped. It was the fact that it reinforced the thought for me, and for those of you who elect to buy a copy of this book afterwards, it will reaffirm in your minds that if you're a parent, as I am, that if your child made that choice, would you abandon them? The Cheneys acted as I think any loving parent would. And it affects you. When your child makes this choice, you may be a deeply religious person, you may want to pray for their salvation, you may want to pray that they change their mind, but in the end, you're the parent, you can do one of 2 things. You can turn your back on the child, which nobody wants to see happen, or you can support them in their decision. It may not have been the decision that you wanted for them, but it's their decision, and you're still their parent.
Well, it's so interesting.
It reinforced that book and reinforced
goes through this whole book because you get a sense from the plaintiffs, from all different perspectives, how difficult this is. It's not something that you would do. It's a hard life. It's a hard choice to make. And one of the plaintiffs, Sandy, her mom doesn't really understand, very Catholic, lives in Iowa. Sort of at first just said, why can't you just marry a man?
Yeah.
And she testified, she just, about the love that she felt, and, it was so moving that listening, you say your mind was sort of opened up. Chuck Cooper, the lawyer on the other side, Sandy and Chris and Jeff and Paul, the four plaintiffs, could never have imagined that their testimony would impact him in any way.
Were you attacked
And
for your reporting? When people knew you were on it, did the general public attack you who may have been opposed to the issue?
No. I mean, not at all. I mean, I think that Chuck Cooper said to me, and I really, this is important to me. I'm a reporter. I want to report the facts. This is a book that I think, there are times in it, whether you agree or disagree with this issue, you cannot help but be moved by the stories of these people as they're going through this and what they went through and how much marriage meant to them. As I said, Chuck Cooper, Chuck Cooper was so moved at one point that by their testimony that he almost was crying, and later he lost the case. He fought really hard. But when he actually saw the images of Chris and Sandy getting married, when he was sitting in his office in Washington, and he told me, I couldn't help but rejoice in their happiness. I mean, that's pretty amazing. This is the guy that bought them all the way. So, I think my idea was just to try to tell the stories, and Chuck has said to me, as has everybody that I wrote about, that they felt that I treated them fairly, that I made their legal arguments. Chuck said I got a fairer shake out of you than any media that I got in 4.5 years. So I think I was interested in laying this stuff out for people with best arguments on both sides so that people could make up their own mind about what they thought after sort of reading about both the emotional aspects of this, the legal aspects, and then this kind of political thriller as well, which is, if you're into campaign books, this is a great campaign story. So
there's another sidebar to this. I've been doing this for almost 40 years. I've interviewed over 25,000 people. I've never met a person who covered the same story for more than a year. For you, 4 years?
Yeah, 4 years.
Okay, I think the audience might appreciate you explaining, how did this work financially? In other words, you got a grant from the Ford Foundation, am I right?
That was at the end. So it took 4.5 years, really. So for most of that time, 3.5 years, as the case wound its way towards the Supreme Court, I took all my vacation time, not just to be with the plaintiffs for the hearing day, but to be there for usually a week in advance, because the book really is all, you're inside the meetings with the lawyers as they're kind of just deciding, should we put this witness on or should we do this? And you don't get that by showing up that day. So I took all my vacation time to be with these guys at the key moments. And by the way, I do want to say Chuck Cooper did not give me, I asked him for it. He did not give me the same kind of access to be in his internal meetings, but he promised to sit down with me and explain what he was thinking and why he was doing the things that he did at the end, and he did do that. So for most of the time, I was working at the New York Times and doing this kind of on the side. And then I was doing all kinds of stories for the New York Times. I mean, I did a story on Obama's kill list and how terrorists get onto it, and a bunch of other things. So then I needed a year to actually just sit down and write this book, because I really wanted to make it not just a kind of, I wanted it to be almost like I wanted it to be a page turner. I wanted it to be something that you don't have, that even if you didn't really care about.
It is that.
Marriage or the issue of marriage, it's just, that all these interesting people and these great lawyers, and if you're into legal thrillers, this would be something that you would want to read. So that takes time, and the Ford Foundation gave me a grant that essentially allowed me to go without my New York Times salary for a year and write this book. So
the principal reason that Dr. John Johnson, the president here at Embry-Riddle, authorized this was, he said, we need to have a discussion that opens us to both sides of the issue. What was the issue really about? Even though it may be against what a reader or listener or participant in the audience, it's against their core beliefs. What happened in the issue? That's what this book does. It takes us through the whole painstaking, and you don't have to be a lawyer to be able to read this either, of the emotions and the time and the frustration. And I keep going back to the Reiners of what they were going to get out of it. I mean, they were so passionate about this topic that they were funding it?
It was their, like Chad Griffin, it was basically like he was their son. I mean, he was like a second son. And they saw how hurt he was with passage of Proposition 8. And it's hard, you know, when you're gay and lesbian and you see the passage of something, it's very hard to not take it personally, to not basically think that my fellow citizens of the state of California just went out to do something to hurt me. And I know that that's not true. And you know, it's interesting. Anthony Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, swing vote on this issue. It's worth saying that this case was decided in a technical way. It was a win, but the issue in terms of the rest of the states is still percolating up, and the Supreme Court later this month is going to have a conference to see which of the cases that are currently pending before it it will take. But this was sort of, I think it'll be, most people, most lawyers on both sides think that this is kind of a fait accompli, that that Scalia was correct when the Supreme Court decided these two cases and said it wasn't deciding the larger issue. And Scalia, in his dissent, said that's ridiculous. So I think most people agree with that. So this is what will happen. Will be perhaps a little anticlimactic.
There was a discussion as to whether certain times they should videotape proceedings, correct?
Yeah.
That was in this. Mm-hmm. And of course, they don't allow video cameras in the Supreme Court. You were in there, correct?
Yes. Well, this was the discussion was over whether to televise the federal district trial.
Correct. And but in the Supreme Court, how did they act? Were they pompous? Were they courteous? Because I hear they could be a pretty rough group.
They are a pretty rough group. You know, a lot of times lawyers are lucky to get a few words out before someone else will just jump
interrupt.
in. They interrupt. I mean, it depends on the justices. I mean, Justice Thomas famously has not really uttered a word, a substantive word in oral argument in years. He just doesn't think it's helpful. Even Justice Ginsburg says, Bader Ginsburg says, you know, most of it is in the briefs. But you know, nobody goes into these oral arguments thinking, you know, taking them lightly, because maybe they don't win the case, but they sure can lose one. So if you aren't on your toes, you can lose a case during oral argument. And you know, I talk about in the book that everybody's so nervous, you know, going to the Supreme Court that day, and you know, it's after all these years of kind of ups and downs and ins and outs, and they're finally at the Supreme Court, and they're walking up the steps, and you know, on the way it was kind of sad, like you know, Chris and Sandy were. Everybody was nervous, and you know, you imagine like you're a plaintiff in these suits, like anything can happen, you know. I mean, there's a lot of emotion around this issue, so you know, everybody's kind of hustling towards the Supreme Court. There's huge crowds and signs on both sides, and they were walking in, and some older man walked by them, and Chris and Sandy were like very nervous, and they were holding hands, and he said, you know, shame. And they both, you know, started, and it was very emotional. But you go in, and it's over like that. I mean, all these years, volumes and volumes, reams of trial transcripts and briefs, and it's like 20 minutes to decide some of the most important.
And the light goes off.
Yeah, it's 30 minutes per side, but because the Solicitor General came in, it's 20 plus he gets 10. And it's really, it's astonishing that it's that short.
And then it's hurry up and wait, and usually the decisions are rendered by the end of June.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
And they kept going back every day to try to, you know, was it going to be today? Because they don't tell you in advance, and nothing leaks out of the Supreme Court. So
it's like white smoke for the Pope.
It is.
If you have a question, let's come to the audience right now. And Alyssa from the left, Kyle from the right. We've got a gentleman up front here, and for our radio audience, you're listening to the President Speaker Series from Embry-Riddle on WNDB. My guest is Jo Becker. She is the author of the book, Forcing the Spring. Good evening, sir. We can hear you.
Question. States' rights and reciprocity in honoring marriages made in one state, honoring or failing to honor it as a marriage in another state. do states have the right to confer privilege of marriage, or is it a fundamental right that they can't change their mind on? The legislation can't say 10 years from now, we changed our mind, it's now illegal again. Is it a right or a privilege granted by states?
Right. Well, so that is the crux of this argument that was made in this book. It's the crux of the legal argument. So, and one way to answer your question is to go back and talk about Loving v. Virginia, which was a case about interracial marriage, and certain states banned it, and other states had voted to allow it, and it was sort of in the political process until there was a federal challenge, and that finally went to the Supreme Court, and Loving v. Virginia was handed down. And essentially what the court has said is, look, yes, marriage is, generally speaking, a state prerogative, right? It's performed by the state, it's recognized by the state, but there's a constitutional floor. Like, you can't, just because a state has a right to do something doesn't mean it can violate the federal constitution. And what the court found in that case was it did. Interracial marriage bans was a violation of both due process and equal protection guarantees of our Constitution. Same arguments are being made here, that the discriminatory nature of these laws creates stigma. Those were arguments made in Loving v. Virginia. And interestingly, some of the southern states that had these bans said things like, well, we do this because it promotes the best child rearing environment, that children of mixed marriages, they're just not going to do too well because society doesn't like that. And so a lot of the same arguments that were made about interracial marriage bans on both sides are being replicated in the arguments here. Ultimately the Supreme Court's going to have to say, I mean, basically Proposition 8 fell, but as I said, the question of whether the bans in all of these other states will survive is it's the crux of your question.
Let's come over to the left here. Good evening, sir.
Okay, when I was a college student, I took some stands that later in life, as I near the end of my life now, I have reversed. So a lot of stands I took at college, I find out now I was wrong. So you're just making a comment that the millennials seem to be more comfortable with this. They may find later in life that maybe that they might want to reverse that position. Maybe, I don't know. But before we change an institution that has served humanity for thousands and thousands of years, did anybody think about the solution might have been a civil union that would give them these legal benefits? Before we changed an institution, could we just, was that ever a thought anywhere? That maybe we should step into this more?
Yes, no, absolutely.
Give them all the rights and privileges of a marriage in something referred to as a civil union. I do believe they explore that.
Yeah,
Jo, can you speak to that?
and I'd encourage you to pick up the book, because that there's a lot of back and forth about that very issue and why and how both sides feel about it. I think that one of the interesting things about the trial that I write about is it turns out, actually, when you say, it's a kind of this institution that's, always had this purpose and always been a certain way, there's a whole history of marriage, and there's a chapter about it. And it turns out, actually, marriage is a pretty complicated and dynamic institution, and it has changed over time, actually. I mean, it used to be, in this country, for instance, that we didn't have interracial marriage. We now do. It has always changed, in a sense, in this country, it's always changed to be more inclusive. Part of what I write about in that history of marriage chapter is how when slaves were freed, they rushed to get married because they saw it as the denial of it. Slaves could not marry because they could not legally consent because they were owned. So they couldn't consent to each other. Only the owners could consent, essentially. And so they saw it as a basic liberty, as a sign that they were free people. And even the notion that marriage is between a man and a woman and always has been across cultures, it has generally been but we still have in many countries, polygamy is practiced in many countries, especially and there were different cultures. The Romans actually, some of the Roman emperors had what was in essence relationships that were considered same-sex marriages. Some of, I think there's some in India. So, I mean, it's a complicated question, and I appreciate it, and I think, and especially on the civil unions front, in terms of wanting to know more about that, I encourage you to read the book and learn more about sort of why one side doesn't believe that that's a equitable solution, and how people feel about it, about the institution of marriage, and the legal arguments on both sides on that.
There, as a follow-up, you write about a common argument, and it is dismissed, that what's next? Is it people with other forms of life? Talking about animals, that's the next step. That's an argument. Was that ever used in any court that the other side came at? If we make it same-sex?
This slippery slope argument.
Yes.
So there's two different arguments that are made to say that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right. One is an equal protection argument. Essentially, is it the state just can't discriminate without having some decent, good, rational reason, and it depends how good of a reason. There's a test, and I won't get into the boring details of that, but you know, if you're just treating similarly situated people differently for no good reason or out of prejudice, that's unconstitutional. There's another argument that says the Supreme Court has recognized that marriage is a fundamental right 14 different times. The Supreme Court has said that prisoners can marry, deadbeat dads can marry. Pretty much, I mean, any kind of challenge, let's say, interracial couples can marry 14 different times. And so when you have a fundamental right, you have to deny that to a group of people, you have to have a compelling state interest, right? That's a really high bar. That's where this slippery slope thing comes in. Well, if you have the right to just, if it's a fundamental right to marry the one that you love versus someone of the opposite sex, what's to prevent me from wanting to marry, you know, there's a moot court and Ted Olson's being grilled by, you know, moot courts are where they practice and they have people that pretend to be the justices. And so one of the women that they brought in was grilling him and saying, why can't I marry my cat? Why can't I marry, you know, my sister? I love my sister. And, you know, the answer to that is, look, there are compelling, for instance, there's compelling state reasons not to allow incest. I mean, there are health reasons, obviously. You don't want to have children. I mean, it's just there are compelling, you know, state interests to say that you shouldn't marry multiple people. You won't be able to take care of other people in the same way. And polygamy is something that's, the courts have said is fine. So I think that those arguments were addressed. They've also been made at every, just to read it, so there's cases, cases all across the country, and every federal district judge but one, and every circuit so far, which is the intermediate circuit courts or circuit appellate courts, are the you win at federal district trial, you lose, and you can appeal to a circuit, and then you go to the Supreme Court. Every circuit, these arguments have been made, and they've been rejected at every circuit. So.
Let's go back in the audience, ma'am. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight.
Good evening. My name is Charlene Cothran, and I am a former active member of the Human Rights Campaign, the Victory Fund, the Gay and Lesbian Task Force. I was very active in the National Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum and many other organizations. I also published an African American gay and lesbian magazine called Venus very successfully in Atlanta for many years, almost 15 years. And yes, sir, like you, I did reverse completely, nearly 8 years ago. So I encourage folk who are thinking that there is something different for you to Google my name. Been on television, and I'm about to do my first book. And I want to say, Ms. Becker, what I think of what I'm hearing of your book. I believe that you are the Sarah Palin of the gay community. They have bought you and paid for you, poured their money into you, and releasing you across the country as their mouthpiece to perpetuate that America has changed its mind. Well, my question for you tonight is, if America has changed its mind, why are they afraid to put it back on the ballot? This country has overwhelmingly voted to ban gay marriage. If America has changed its mind, why not put it back to a vote? That's question number one.
Well,
Okay,
that's
well, let me just
that.
stop
I can
there.
give you one question. You want to respond to
Let's-
the it's a
yeah.
personal attack as well.
Yeah, so that is just simply, I mean, I want to specifically say I was not bought and paid for. I received no money from the groups, any of the gay rights groups. I covered this as I would, you know, I'm a New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, and you know, so
You are
so I
not
wanna sort of-
underwritten by.
I'm not underwritten. Yeah, written. That and not only that, but nobody had the right to read this book before it was published. They didn't have any veto rights. I was let in to document what I saw. I spent 4 years reporting on what I saw. To your other question, I would say that, you know, look, the opinion polls are the opinion polls, you know, and name it. There's not one poll that doesn't show movement in the direction of marriage equality, and there's not one poll now that doesn't show support for same-sex marriage at over 50%. So I, you know, think that there's sort of evidence to say that the country is moving, not just my opinion.
Well, let me ask, why is it not on the ballot?
So
To follow up to
it
that.
did go on the ballot, actually.
It did?
The last, the last election, in 4 states, same-sex marriage was on the ballot. In Washington, Maryland, and Maine, they voted to extend the right to marry to gay and lesbian couples. And in Minnesota, they voted against a proposed constitutional amendment to enshrine a ban on same-sex marriage into their constitution. So it's
it has
also
a
not
point.
true that they've never won. But when the case was brought, they were over 30. So
Okay.
since then, there's been, in the 4 states where it's gone on the ballot, they have won.
Do you envision more ballot activity for this question?
You know, I think that most people are waiting for. I don't think that there's a lot going on the ballot in the midterms.
Nothing here.
And by the time our next presidential election rolls around, you're going to have a Supreme Court decision, is my guess, and it's in all likelihood we will have that. So it would be irrelevant whether it's going on the ballot.
Okay, I hope you'll forgive me. I generally don't need to do this, but to sort of admonish the audience of not attacking the guest personally. If you have a question, we will certainly welcome that question, but I prefer not to hear any further attacks. Sir, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I have a question about your description of the same-sex marriage question as being equivalent to the segregation Rosa Parks. I think you made reference to the
That's in the book.
revolution and so forth.
Sure.
And I grew up in a segregated society. There's no question that generational changes have made segregation be an issue that was morally incorrect and is not opposed by most of the fair-thinking people in this country. Abortion, for example, is a different issue.
Can you get to the question? Because I'm running out of time.
Abortion hangs on a moral issue in a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court. Why do you think the same-sex marriage is a fait accompli, that in a period of time it'll be something accepted rather than being an issue like abortion that is still hangs in the balance of a morality issue and in a divided country?
Sure, I'd love to answer that question. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, one of the issues and why people were afraid of taking this issue to the Supreme Court was that there would be a backlash similar to the one that occurred after the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, liberal justice who is a supporter of abortion rights, regrets that the court moved as quickly as it did in Roe. And so there was a lot of back and forth as this case got closer and closer to the Supreme Court. Would the court be worried about a backlash? I think that so far, what you've seen as these you've seen just a rash of court decisions in the wake of these 2 cases going to the Supreme Court. In Utah, in places in the country where if there was going to be a backlash, you would certainly expect there to be one. And so far, it's been a kind of collective shrug. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that you hardly ever see, name a Republican elected official that goes on radio programs or television programs anymore and takes the position that gays and lesbians should be denied the right to marry. They're all laying low. So I think that the idea that there's some kind of lurking outrage, so far it hasn't materialized. I mean, that's all we can say. I mean, I take your point that...
I had Pat Buchanan on the air. He wouldn't take it. He wouldn't take the pledge. Ron DeSantis wouldn't take the pledge. John Micah wouldn't take the pledge. Ashcroft wouldn't take the pledge. None of these guys don't want to. It's almost radioactive at this point.
Well, I also think, look, let's be fair to these guys and not say it's just all about politics. I think the country's trying to grapple with this issue. I think that if you look at... I'm sorry to interrupt you, is the moral majority losing? They were controlling things for a while. Have they lost their effectiveness? I think that the questioner's question that people, opposition to abortion remains strong. So it's not that social issues are just going by the wayside. I think that people are having a conversation in this country about marriage, and getting married is different. I mean, it is a different sort of thing. It's than abortion, and I would say that 1 out of 4 people, Pew polling shows that 1 out of 4 people that now support same-sex marriage used to have the opposite view. So people are changing their minds.
Is there any statistical evidence, before we go back to the audience, that indicates what a report that I saw, that same-sex couples stay together more often by percentage than heterosexual couples? In other words, is there less, it may be too immature in the study for it to be conclusive, but there was some audience being given to an argument that they don't break up as often.
Right. I mean, Anthony Kennedy talked about during the arguments, and it was interesting because Chris and Sandy, they had 4 boys, 2 of whom were at the Supreme Court that day. And he was, as typical of Anthony Kennedy, wrestling with himself. He's, on the one hand, there's tradition, but on the other hand, what about the 40,000 kids living in California being raised by same-sex couples? Don't they have a voice here too? I think that certainly, I think that most people agree that marriage is a stabilizing force. There was evidence in the trial about the economic benefits of marriage, all sorts of benefits of marriage, health benefits. It's actually pretty astonishing how better off you are if you're married. And so it's not surprising that people who are married hopefully think twice before they split up.
Let's come back in the audience. Thank you. We invited several people from the legal community to be here as well. Good evening.
Hi, Mark. Lloyd Bowers, law firm Wicksham Bowers. I would never attack you. So my comment simply is, I remember so clearly when Lawrence v. Texas was handled down in 2003, which was the Supreme Court case that overturned Bowers versus Hardwick, which said that sodomy laws were unconstitutional. A seminal case. I think if it wasn't for Lawrence v. Texas, we wouldn't be here today talking about marriage, because we had to make the love between 2 people of the same gender as being non-criminal before we'd ever get to the argument we had today. But there was a poll that was done then that said even at that point, and that was 2003, which then was almost 40 years after Loving v. Virginia, which was 1966, that 1/5 of the American public at that point still thought that interracial marriage should not be allowed. So just because the Supreme Court hands down a decision, that doesn't mean that everyone always comes along. And even though times change, there's still going to be an element of the population that it's going to take a while for them to come along with this. So the point that you make is very interesting and very valid as far as the difference between abortion and marriage and the rights of marriage and the rights of couples. What I would be curious to have your take on is your opinion of Justice Feldman's decision in the Eastern District of Louisiana, who is the one judge who has gone in the opposite direction, because I don't know if you've read his opinion, but the majority of it does focus on families and child rearing and the importance of having a mother and a father, which I thought was interesting. even more so in the fact that Judge Feldman began his career as the first law clerk for John Minor Wisdom, who was considered to be one of the preeminent Southern civil rights jurists, who wrote most of the great opinions that overturned a lot of the laws against integration in the South in the 50s and 60s.
Well, I'd say, on that, two things. One is that it definitely, as you point out, goes against the tide of all the other judges who have considered this. Many of them, Republican appointees, so it's not coming down a kind of partisan basis. That case, they did not have a trial. So, I think that, the trial record of the Perry case, the case that I read about Prop 8, they addressed all of these things. Judge Walker subjected these arguments to the crucible of cross-examination. Kept saying, where are the facts? What is the harm? What's the harm of allowing gays and lesbians to marry? And at one point, Chuck Cooper, and this kind of what was dubbed the Cooper blooper by the political team pushing for this case, was just that I don't know. I don't know. And, his argument really was, since we're not totally sure, we shouldn't, Californians should be allowed to press the pause button, is sort of what he said. But, in fact, Californians didn't do that, right? Californians didn't say, let's see how Massachusetts and these other states do and see if it is causing some sort of big disruption for heterosexual marriage, and we'll have a temporary ban of 5 years. They enshrined it into their constitution, so it was hard to make that argument. I would just say that, if you read the book and look at the evidence, you can come to your own conclusions about a judge making the kind of claims that he did in that decision without the benefit of a trial.
And it was also not only a case without a trial, but it was also a summary judgment where he took on issues that weren't even before the court, because he only had before him whether that Louisiana should recognize as marriages from another state. Exactly. And he said, I'm also going to take on the right of whether Louisianans should be able to marry, even though that was not before him, which I thought was interesting.
Thank you, Lloyd. Appreciate it. Coming back over here, Alyssa now with someone on the other side.
Hi, I'm Tim Wilson. I'm on the faculty here at Embry-Riddle. This is my husband, Mac McKinley. I know that feeling that Chad Griffin felt in 2008 because I worked the polls here in Florida for Amendment 2. We lost by an over 60% margin, and had a woman at the polls look at me straight in the eye and say, "It's an abomination." So I know that sinking feeling that Chad Griffin had at that point. But I also know the elation that I had when my partner and I went to New York and got married, and just how much our lives have been better because we got married, and that it does make a difference to be called married, to call him my husband, that makes a real difference in our lives and in what other people think about us.
I talk a lot about that in the book. Thanks. You really get to, whether you agree or don't agree, you have to, in some ways, identify, I think, as you follow these 4 people in their lives, and, they talk about, I'm a straight person, I'm married, my husband and I, if we check into a hotel, nobody says, oh gosh, I have you down for a king, obviously that's a mistake.
You just leaped into the issue that nobody wanted to ask. She must be gay that she wrote this. She's not. She's married to a guy from the New York Times. Onward and upward.
Anyhow, that doesn't happen to me. But it's just it's a terrible feeling where they talk about, you go to the doctor's office and there's a form and it says, are you married, divorced, or single? And there's no box for you. And that makes you feel like you just don't exist almost. And they talk about it. And again, like whatever, your religious beliefs or something, it's very hard when you read that stuff to not feel like, oh.
It did. It kind of staggered me too. It did. In the audience, up front now.
Hi. So it seems that you get a lot of questions, and perhaps even as you were writing, anticipated questions about what made all these straight people want to get involved in this fight, like that kind of questioning. And so with the Rob Reiner story, for example, and the idea that this man is like a son to him and that sort of thing. So I wonder how often it comes up that while that may be true, that some of it is just, it's a basic human right and I'm going to care about it because I care about people, is that something that is just hard for people to understand, you find? Or, so there always kind of needs to be that personal story that explains their interest?
I just
or
think
advocacy?
it always, you know, I mean, for all of us, right? I mean, whenever we have a conversation with each other about things, it's, you know, the more that you can kind of say how it relates to your own life, I just think that's, people are more willing to kind of discuss and think about that. I mean, I wanted to tell a story, you know, I wanted to tell a story that you'd want to read, and that would, you know, kind of be, as we said, like a page turner, and along the way be educated on both sides of why people feel the way that they do, what are the legal arguments. But I always tried to make it to come back to the personal. So you would sort of, at any given moment, you know, talk about, you know, there was a debate at one, I'll give you an example. There was a debate at one point, and the lawyers were in a room. They were putting together a videotape that was going to be evidence of animus, evidence that the campaign was motivated by prejudice. The gay lawyers and the straight lawyers had a big difference of opinion about one particular piece that they wanted to put on. And it basically was, you know, my child went to a lesbian wedding. Think it can't happen. It can happen. It has happened here. And it was a campaign commercial. The straight lawyer said, I don't know about that. Like that, I think it's offensive, but I'm worried that that might actually resonate with some judge up the line in the wrong way. And the gay lawyers all said, well, whoa, wait a minute. You know, this is exactly the kind of insidious discrimination. You're basically saying that certain kinds of weddings are okay and other kinds aren't. And they're like, what do you mean? We don't teach, you know, we don't teach about straight weddings to kindergartners or first graders. And they're like, absolutely, every fairy tale is about that. We have, you know, flower girls and ring bearers. And it clicked to this one guy, and he said, you know, you're right. Like, we're basically saying that it's okay to bring children to one kind of wedding, but not to another. And that is treating similarly situated events completely differently, and it is motivated by prejudice. So he did go ahead and put it on, and it was aired in the court.
We have a question that's come in from Ray Sanchez of Volusia 912. He says, ask about the root of matrimony. Matri, and this is Latin, means mother. Mon means man. Did that ever come up in the argument?
It did not come up in the arguments, but the history of marriage, as I said, very much did. And the idea that you know, marriage has always been static and the same, I think, is not totally supported by the evidence. Moreover, I think that you know, just because something is rooted in tradition, there's actually a Supreme Court case on this point where the Supreme Court said just because it's rooted in tradition doesn't make it constitutional.
We have time for a couple more questions before we part company tonight. Is there anyone we've missed before we conclude? Alyssa will run up, and Mike, one more.
Howdy. I have kind of an overarching question about marriage, because you brought up the point that the definition of marriage and our ideas is very dynamic and individual. How much do you actually believe it is the state, and by that I mean the government business marriage, and how much control or government, if they actually involvement they should even have in the whole issue?
Right. That's a great question. It's one that Judge Walker asked. He's a libertarian and Republican appointee, but generally has a libertarian sort of streak. And during the arguments, Judge Walker asked Olson, well, it seems to me, Judge Walker said, the problem is that the state is in the business of bestowing this honor of marriage. And that is what's causing the problems, because it's bestowing it on one set of people, but saying civil unions are you know, relegated to the other set of people. And he looks at Olson, he says, what if we just got out of the business of marriage altogether and everything was called a civil union? And Olson sort of stuttered. Judge Walker really did catch him off guard with that question and kind of came out of left field. And eventually he said, well, I guess, you know, if that were really the case and nobody was in it, I guess we wouldn't have an equal protection problem. But let's face it, I mean, go to the ballot and tell the state of California or the state of Florida that we're going to abolish marriage. That's probably not going to happen.
Let's see, are we done? Did we get everybody? We have one gentleman up here. We'll take this as our last question tonight.
I actually have a question for you. So when you were asked if your kids were to be gay, and would you
I'm sorry,
accept it-
could you say that again?
This question's for you. Joe asked you if your kids were to be gay, would you accept it, and you said that you would accept their choice. I was just wondering what you meant by that.
If one of my children said that they were gay,
You said that you would.
when
approve
I
their
was
choice.
saying choice, I was talking about if they elected to marry in a same-sex situation. If one of my children said that they were gay, I would accept them, of course. I would not turn them away. And I think that that's what most people, that was the point I was trying to make. I think that's what most people who love their children would say. They would not turn them away. Did that answer your question, sir? Okay. There are just a couple of people I want to thank. Bob Score, who's come back after a week of travel to video this tonight, to Tony Petro and Richard Weekly up above, who ran the controls and got everything here. John Warren back at our radio station, who's producing tonight. To Kyle and Alyssa, thank you so much for helping from the audience. I want to tell you about our next event. 3 weeks in a row we're doing these President's Speakers Series events. Next Tuesday night, the threat of nuclear weapons to this country and EMPs. Frank Gaffney is the former assistant, one of the assistant secretaries of defense during the Reagan administration. He'll be here to talk about the threat of electromagnetic pulses to world security. What happens if the lights go out and don't come back? An explosion that, if just above the atmosphere, takes out the entire electrical grid. How would we live as a society? We'll talk about the real threat and what this country is doing to stop that threat. That's next Tuesday night here at the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle. It begins at 7, doors will open at 6, and it will be broadcast live on 93.5 AM 1150 WNDB. We hope to see you all here once again. And we have a continuing series for the fall. You'll learn more about that through our website, erau.edu. We have events that will take you right through November, and then our big series begins in January. Once again, a round of applause for our guest from the New York Times, Jo Becker. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Have a very pleasant evening.